Good morning. I'm actually still fairly new to Nashville. Well, it's 2 years now. I came to Vanderbilt Divinity School. Before that, I spent 22 years in Dallas, Texas, Perkins School of Theology. Before that, I was a grad student at Duke University. And before that, I grew up as a German Methodist, fifth generation in Germany. Very small Methodist church, and I went to seminary there and realized that Methodism is a lot bigger than I thought it would be. So here with powerful Nashville Methodists, and I'm glad to be here this morning to talk a little bit about theology, but I never just want to talk about theology as ideas. I really talk about theology as something that moves us, as something that has to be in touch what people are doing in real life and on the ground. So it's always both, you have big ideas and then you have sort of some real tasks on the ground that you also have to discuss. It makes us Methodists ultimately, that we're not just talking about ideas, but that we're really putting these things at work on the ground in a way, that gels with some of the old holiness traditions. This is right, that is at work with some other sort of religious and Christian traditions also. So it's not just Methodists for themselves, but there's something that we have in Methodism that pushes a bit, and that's what I want to talk about. So look at this as a talk about Methodist theology, but not just for Methodists. Really, sort of the question is, what difference does this make in the world? Now, one thing you don't find on this list here, I guess it was drawn from an older list, is my most recent book on Wesleyan theology. The title is No Religion But Social Religion. And this is a quote from John Wesley. This is actually how Wesley talks about religion. No religion but social religion. And then Brandon, I think, put this in the title, Methodists as the Social People. Now, you might think this is all about social action, but this whole social religion is a way of being in relationship with each other, with the world, and also in relationship with God. So the social piece here is not just, we have to be more social than we usually are. It is the foundation of our faith. This is where things are really happening. An earlier book on Methodist theology I wrote was titled Grace Under Pressure. This is the sort of thing I want to you could say that in Methodist theology, this is all about God's grace at work in the world, in people's lives. But I'm going to emphasize this notion of grace under pressure. This is actually a phrase I stole from Ernest. Talked about that first. But I think it really matches Methodist theology well. When we talk about grace, we're not so much talking about grace in abstract or on the mountaintops. We're talking about grace in the midst of the pressure. This is where God is at work. If you look at John Wesley's life, this is where he found God at work in all kinds of ways. Grace was always at work under pressure. And early on, when the Methodists started gathering in Oxford as a student, what was so amazing about that wasn't just that, they were studying the Bible together. And so a lot of people do that. But that they were studying the Bible in real life and that they always put together their faith action. So for them, visiting the sick, dealing with people in need, already as students, young students who were studying the Bible, wasn't just sort of a little addendum, but this was substantially part of their faith and what the Methodist movement carried with it all these ways. Now, when the churches became a little bit more powerful, more established, sometimes in the church you could see a bit more perspective. I'm not sure, of course, I'm not talking about West End Methodist Church because this is not a comment on who you are, but I travel around the world a lot, not just Methodism, but a lot of other religious communities. The challenges I see is that a lot of religion these days has become self-centered. So when people become more self-sufficient, when they build their institutions, when they have sort of their assigned seats, in the church, and when people become established, becomes self-centered in a way that's probably just normal. It happens to people. But then the question becomes, how do we tie ourselves back to this notion of grace under pressure and how we observe what's going on? So that's what I want to talk about today, this notion of grace being most alive, most active under pressure. And in order to talk about that, you need to add some observations. You need to pay attention. How is grace actually experienced? It's one thing to say, God's grace will always come through for you, but it's a lot more interesting to talk about how God's grace is actually at work in your life. Tell the stories, and so on. When I grew up in Germany as a young kid in the Methodist church, this is longer ago than I wish it was, 60s, 70s, there was a lot of these wicked, where people talked about how they experienced God in their lives. My dad was a lay preacher, my mom too. Eventually, they would talk a lot about how they experienced God in their lives. Took the message to the villages and the farms up on the hills around the little town. That was what the farmers cared about. Not so much, what's your idea about God, but what difference does God make? And so here, when you look at the situation, the argument is you really have to work a little bit to see what's God doing there. And these are not easy miracle stories. The point here is not to say, well, I'm happy and God put me there. But now you really have to pay attention when things are hurting. You really have to pay attention to what people are suffering. And unless you have an answer for that, unless you have sort of a way of engaging those places and have some good answers for what God's doing, faith may not be as relevant as you think it is. That's the challenge. So sometimes, when I teach theology, students, they might say, well, all this stuff about suffering and pain in the world, of course you want to help. How is that relevant to our human theology, right? How is that relevant to who we are? And I say, unless you face what's really happening around you, and unless you develop some good answers to that, you might in the bubble, but who cares about that, except you and your friends? This is the problem of the church, of course, that becomes self-centered. Who cares if we're a happy community, if the world around us is sort of sinking under water and into distress? The question here is, what do we have to do? Now, one way to approach this, since I'm a theologian, I also need to do a little bit of sort of hard notes theology. Not just talking about experiences, but sort of the bigger ideas behind that. So this morning I'll talk a little bit about an old tradition that John Wesley picked up from his Anglican heritage, and that is the so-called means of grace. I'm not sure that you're talking much about that here, but it's sort of underlying a lot of what we're doing as Methodists. And the means of grace in the old Anglican tradition were reading the Bible, praying, and Holy Communion. Those were the things that were most important. And in the old Anglican Book of Common Prayer, it goes something like this: means of grace is an inward sign of, an outward grace and a means by which we receive the same. Or use the modern language, means of grace are channels by which we receive God's grace in our lives. And so if you look at Bible, prayer, in that light, it becomes a little more interesting than what we're usually thinking. So for instance, if you look at prayer as a channel of God's grace, you could say, well, this is a two-way street. So prayer is not just me talking, it's also me listening. That second part, that may be a little more difficult, especially if you're usually focused on what we have to do. So as a means of grace for prayer, it's a way of talking, but also of listening. Reading on the one hand, we say we're reading the Bible, but the more interesting conversation would be, and how is the Bible reading us? The two-way street thing, right? So it's not just you're reading words in the Bible, but what you're reading there, that's the means of grace. That's sort of the channel thing where we receive God's grace, a means by which we receive God's grace in the Anglican language. And Holy Communion is interesting there too, because not me sort of being there, getting something out of it, but formed on the. So as you start to listen, as you start having the Bible read to you, as you start participating in the community, something happens to you. You will not be the same person when this is over. Now, that's sort of Anglican theology, and if you talk to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he would explain that to you, and maybe in the future she would explain that to you. And so this is good theology. We could spend several sessions. But I want to move on a little bit to what the Methodists are adding to that, what sort of John Wesley did with that, because in John Wesley's later writings, this is part of that in the little book, Grace Under Pressure. John Wesley sort of at the end of his life adds another element to the means of grace. Well, earlier on, for those of you who are looking at the technical aspect, that's interesting. But later in his life, he says, works of mercy are also a means of grace. Even though we're not commonly talking about that, he says. Works of mercy are also a means of grace. This is where I want to spend a little time this morning, because it seems to me maybe this is one of the specific things we have as Methodists. We're not talking about it as much as we talk about the other things. Works of mercy as a means of grace. The first thing you have to say, what I just said, is this is a two-way street. Like the Bible, it's not just reading the Bible also reads you. So with works of mercy, it's not just what you do for others. In fact, the more interesting part is what in being at work mercifully for others happens to you, what comes back. What is the two-way street? So while we talk a lot about in-reach, we talk about outreach, right? But we don't talk much about what I tongue-in-cheek called at some point in-reach. So what comes back to us as we reach out? What comes back? And of course, the question then is not just what comes back and makes us feel happy, but what comes back and transforms us. So all of a sudden, social action, social people, and all of that is no longer just something that we also do after we've done our religious work. But what comes back now is what shapes us deeply, what transforms us, and also what helps us encounter God in a very different, unusual way. So it's not surprising that the late Wesley at some point says he's known Methodists that have fallen from grace. By the way, this is another thing that makes us a little different as Methodists, say, from Presbyterians. There's no one safe rule. In Methodism, you can always fall from grace. Well, don't worry too much, but it's not. And Wesley basically says he's known Methodists that have fallen from grace because they did not understand mercy were actual means of grace. So think about it. You have Methodists that go to church every Sunday, that pray every day, that read the Bible, that do everything else that's required. And Wesley, those people have still fallen from grace because they have not understood the importance of works of mercy in all of that. Now, some of my colleagues would say, well, this is sort of the late Wesley talking, maybe a reminiscing, maybe a little senile already. The younger Wesley didn't say that. Well, the younger Wesley, in a way, didn't say it like that, but he always practiced it. This is Wesley's life, you know it, right? I mean, Wesley wasn't just a great preacher, he was also out there working people, visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, visiting people in prison, and so on. All the way, we're not in the midst of a healthcare debate right now, but Wesley was interested in popular health. He actually wrote a little book called The Primitive Physic that was about healthcare. And so Wesley, all his life, was always involved in these things. For those of you who studied Methodism, you're probably aware of the so-called general rules. This is something that's part of our Methodist doctrinal standards. And every time I teach a course on Methodist theology to Vanderbilt Methodist students, they're these things. Apparently, they're not picking that up where they grow up. But the general rules basically say there are three rules. One is do no harm, do good. And then the third one is attend upon all the ordinances of God. Piety, that's your reading the Bible, praying, Holy Communion. but do no harm and do good in the general rules actually come before works of piety. So the charge before us is, when we think about how do we pick or how do we put these so-called works of piety together with the so-called works of mercy, what happens when these two things come together? And for Wesley, apparently that was an essential thing, even though it took time to figure it out theologically. This is the way theology works in general. Sometimes it takes us a long time to figure out stuff. But that's why I'm actually pretty excited to keep doing my after all these years. This year is, more than 3 decades since I entered seminary. And I've done this work for 3 decades. And we're still finding out stuff. So what are we finding out? Pay attention to this part. This is where it gets interesting. What happens when you put works of mercy and works of piety together? Now, when I talked about this, probably started talking about the pushback was immediately, you're putting too much emphasis on the works of mercy. Aren't we supposed to be afraid of works righteousness? Right? There's works righteousness where you earn salvation by doing things. And are you righteousness? Are you not preaching a social gospel where people must do this and must do that and must do the other? And the easy answer is to say, no, it's actually the opposite. I mean, you wouldn't put praying in the category of works righteousness or reading the Bible, right? I mean, you would sort of say, this is how I avail myself of God's grace. This is how I open up to God's grace. By reading the Bible, I'm not doing the work. I'm sort of putting myself in God's grace, becoming a recipient. And it's the same thing for works of mercy. It's not so much about what you do, but how you open up. How you open up to other people. And in opening up to other people, my argument is you're opening up to God. So if the church is all about opening ourselves up to God, I would say we need a little help with that, because sometimes when you think you're hearing God's voice, you may be hearing your own. Perkins once wrote a book on, basically his thesis was, we have to ask more God questions and less me questions. And everyone was really happy about, oh yes, we have to ask more God questions. But how do you know God questions are not concealed me questions? That's the big problem of theology. What if we're not really connecting to something outside, but really something that's in our own minds? How do we double check? And the argument here is with this works of mercy word is to say, maybe by relating to other people, maybe by becoming open to others, by being able to listen to other people, we're training something that makes us more open to listen to God as well. That's sort of the argument. If you can't relate to another person, if you cannot listen to anyone, well, chances are you can't listen to God much either. So this is a training ground. Starting to become open, starting to pay attention. This is why a self-centered church is so detrimental. It's not just because it's not socially active, but because it's inventing its own God. So a church that opens up beyond itself may have something that others don't, namely connected to something, not only people beyond itself, but God really bigger than us, right? We would know that as Methodists. So now, putting these things together, I'll push this a little bit further. As you enter into this conversation, works of mercy, not history, the real question is, what are we learning? What are we picking up? And this is where, of course, we'd be great to have a conversation, because I'm pretty sure that you have some experiences of your own. So this is not just me bringing talk about, but my challenge to you would be to think about, what have you learned by interacting with other people? What have you learned by dealing with the pain of this world? And not just about the pain of this world, but what have you learned about, and what have you learned about yourself? That's sort of an interesting line of questioning now. If you do a whole series on that, we could go around and say, we've learned this and that. Except that we usually don't plug that back into our theology. This is where the theologian might be helpful and say, if you learn this, maybe this means something about how you think about God. And quite frankly, I'll say this as a little side note, and this is something I found for me. Sometimes it is more difficult to talk about God in church than anywhere else. That sounds strange, right? That sounds crazy. But the problem with this is that oftentimes in our churches, and this is not at anybody, but oftentimes in our churches, we think we know God so well that we never have to have another conversation. Or if somebody raises a comment or a question, we get a little defensive. So the God thing is the thing we have down. But my argument is maybe this is the thing we really need to work on. Think relationship. If you're relating to somebody, think a spouse, think a partner, at the moment, when you think out the other person completely, everything there is to know about that person, well, maybe that relationship is dead. If your friend, your partner, your spouse cannot surprise you anymore, make you angry a little bit at some point, or make you laugh or something, then maybe there's not much of a relationship. So think about our relationship with God like that. My question here is simply, what would help us rekindle our relationship with God in a way that makes it not only more interesting and fun, but also more challenging and maybe more productive. So here, back to the works of mercy, for Wesley out there among the people, I think he learned a few things that he could not have learned otherwise. One of the great Wesleyan theologians at SMU, maybe you're still Albert always talked about Wesley. I almost say Jesus. I mean to say Wesley. Albert talked about Wesley, not Jesus. Wesley as a folk theologian. You can say the same thing about Jesus was a folk theologian. But what Albert meant was, here's this highly trained Oxford academic who was able to transform theology down to the people in such a way that they could understand it. It was great, fine. People can do it, some people can't. But what Albert didn't talk about, and what we need to talk about, is the other way around. The folk theologian, what did he learn from the people? What is it that he actually picked up from the others? And I've been challenging the Methodist historians for 2 decades at least, a little bit more, to do some studies on that, and nobody has tackled. But that's the question. What is it that we're learning about God with other people? So that's what Wesley taught, called works of mercy. I'd like to push it a little bit further and say, man, it's not just works of mercy. Why do we call this works of justice? Because justice implies the so it's not just what I do for others, but what I do in such a way that our relationship becomes more mutual. That it's not just from me to you, but something coming back from the other to me. Or one step further, this would be a whole other series, so maybe Raymond will have me back at some point. We'll talk about that. Talk about works of solidarity. It's not just about me helping others, but somehow and in that relationship, growing as a person, growing as a community, and growing in our relationship with God. That's what we're talking about. So that's the foundational thing here. And I think this is something we find very clearly in Methodist theology in a way that you don't find it necessarily elsewhere. Not that other denominations wouldn't have it, but here we have a gold mine that is absolutely crucial. Add another piece, and this is sort of now going beyond my middle road theologian friends. That there's a lot of Methodist theologians out there these days that are very happy to say we're a pluralistic church, we have a high church tradition, we have a social activist tradition, we have a charity tradition, we have a justice tradition. We have it all. What I'm interested in is not so much that we have it all, but what put these things together so that they reshape each other. That's why I'm here as a theologian and not as a social activist. My question is, what happens when we put these things back into our conversation? Into our theologies, into our talk about God, into our thinking about Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the church, saint salvation, and all of that. That's part of what I'm doing in the new book, No Religion but Social Religion, talking about doctrines that all of a sudden come to new life. That's the fascinating thing. And the great thing is, I'm not just doing that by myself. This is something that's happening all around the world. These are conversations that whenever I leave the country, especially in what we once called, the third world, two-third world, where you have some very lively conversations, not just about the needs of people, but how do we think about traditions in a way that's much more not only practical, but passionate, alive, and full of life, full of agency, full of excitement. So here the thing is, rather than what happens when we bring it together? Now think about reading the Bible. This is the works of piety, not the traditional music. If you're engaged somewhere, outside of your four walls of your church, in real life, reading the Bible, sometimes you see a few things that you would not see otherwise. It's well known that there are more than 2,000 passages in both Testaments, Old and New, that poverty and justice. There's a poverty and justice Bible, check it out, that has orange markings of all the passages that talk about poverty and justice in the Bible. It's really adds up to more than 2,000. Project, because you open your Bible and there's orange in almost every page, and a lot of times whole pages are orange. Now, how come the church is not talking about that oftentimes? Well, that's because we're not reading this book in a way that's a two-way street. We're sort of reading it with our own eyes, with our own presuppositions, and we're not really being opened up by anything else. So as you start moving, dealing with grace under pressure, and you come back reading the Bible, you'll see a few things that you've never noticed. I mean, I could give you many examples, but that's the story of my life as a theologian. To see things I still keep seeing things that I did not ever know were there, that are right there, but you don't see it by yourself, just sitting there reading your Bible with your. So this is one. Sacred prayer. When we think about how we pray, if it's a two-way street, as I said earlier, where we listen and go, what do we listen to? I mean, ask yourself, what are we praying for? What is a great conversation? Holy Communion. This is one of the great things in Methodism. As you know, we have this open table tradition, which I think is really powerful. It's not just the all come message. It's not just, we part of it. It's sort of another way of broadening our community in such a way that we're realizing we cannot celebrate Holy Communion just with our friends. Maybe in this circle, maybe by bringing in people, you know how the invitation reads. Christ our Lord invites all who love Him, who earnestly repent of their sins and want to live in peace with Him. If those are the people that gather around the communion table, imagine what that would be doing to our churches. How that would not only vitalize us, but perhaps make us see some things that we don't see right now. This goes to some of what we're usually doing in terms of our common sense. There was a tradition, as you all know. This is a sort of history of perhaps Europe, Western Europe, the United States, where there was an assumption that other people who are different from us are not fully human. This is why we had slavery, this is why we had conquests, colonialism, and so on. Then, going down, people finally realized other people are also fully human. It was a major next step, realizing that other people are also human. And so you have well-meaning people now. We did a lot of traveling when my daughters were around the world. And there's always well-meaning people that go out into the street somewhere in Africa and tell their children, look, these Africans are people like us. And that's certainly a much better approach. They're not people like us. They're below us, right? So you're now there, you're saying, well, they're people too, they're fully human too. But what I'm pushing for is one more step that's usually not part of our common sense, the way we use it. This is now, they're people like us. But the next step is to say, we are people like them. And then it's not you defining other people from your own perspective, but you are now being defined by other people. Imagine when that happened. Of course, this is now a larger conversation about what we mean by works of mercy. We're not just stepping out there shaping other people in our own image. We're actually out there in order to how we are being like other people. That's sort of exciting. And once that happens, the other thing happens also, namely, you're now entering into conversation about who is God here? What does it mean to talk? What does it mean to talk about grace, holiness, in all the traditional terms, for Wesleyans we talk about sanctification, we talk about holiness, but all of that now turns around. It's not just so much about us, but about So ultimately, I'll close here. When we talk about Methodists as a social people, we're not just talking about people who are socially active or who are very friendly and you enjoy walking into their churches, but something that shapes us all the way to the core, where everything we do is a two-way street. Means of grace are ultimately a two-way street, and the way we relate to other people is a two-way street. Now, that's sort of, I'm hoping it makes sense to you. The real question is, how do we act on that?